You're in here to learn about salt.
Yes.
It's a hot, salty topic, and it's one of my favorite topics because it's something we can do something about. You know, there's so many things. You can't change your parents, and you can't change your age, but you can change your salt intake without too much devastation. I mean, it is hard. It's very hard in our society today. The companies are just starting to realize there's a market out there for low sodium products. Boy, about 15 years ago, they finally got on the cholesterol bandwagon, and all my bananas are labeled low in cholesterol. You know, I mean, they never did have cholesterol to begin with, and now they're low in it. So the companies realize, you know, this is all marketing. They're trying to sell us stuff. And they realized that cholesterol was a hot topic, and so they got on that bandwagon. But for a lot of different reasons, they can't quite get on the bandwagon for low sodium. So the low sodium products are kind of miserable, and they're expensive and hard to find and so forth. So I'd like to just give you in the next 20 minutes a couple tips on how to work with sodium, why we should do it to start out with. I mean, why bother with sodium? You know, I'm a cardiologist, and in my business, I see a lot of people with high blood pressure. And I see a lot of women with high blood pressure. And maybe it doesn't affect us when we're 20 or 30 or 40, but boy, it catches up to us when we're 60, 70, and 80. And salt, in the majority of people, now there's a few percentage of people that are not affected by salt and their blood pressure, but the majority of us really, it raises our blood pressure. And it does that in some interesting ways. Remember in high school when you did that experiment, when you put the salt on one side of a barrier and water on the other, and the one with the salt increased in water? Salt holds on to water in our body. And so when we give our kidneys, our body, when we ingest a teaspoonful of salt, what our body does is it holds on to water to equilibrate that, because our body knows it shouldn't have too much salt, and our blood shouldn't be too salty. So it holds on to water, and then I think of our vascular system as a big closed tank. And some places here, the blood doesn't leak out somewhere, and so we have this tank full of salt and water. And if the tank gets too full, the plasma weeps out in our feet because the gravity is pulling down. So women get a lot of ankle swelling, especially when it's hot, or when they're on a plane, or when they're in the car for a long period of time. And that's kind of miserable. It raises blood pressure by making every tiny of those millions and millions of cells in the lining in our arteries, it plumps them up and makes them stiffer. So if you stiffen up, you know, like those walls of water things that you put around your tomatoes, they're flat when you start out, and then you fill them with water, and then they puff up. Well, our blood vessels are kind of like that. They puff up, and that makes them stiffer and makes our pressure go up. So stiff blood pressure, stiff arteries, arterioles, raise our blood pressure. And it's a fascinating physiology, and it's the same for all of us. All of us have that problem. As we get higher blood pressure over the years, then things like strokes, and especially in women. You know, strokes come along in the 70s and 80s in women. And I know you probably all know someone with a stroke, and you just can't take it back. You know, I can do a lot of things for people's hearts, and we can put in valves, and we can do some really exciting things, but we don't know in 2014 how to take strokes back. If we catch them early, we can give some clot-busting drugs and do some exciting things to restore blood flow. But if the tissue is damaged here, you know, we can't take it back. So we want to do everything that we know how to do to prevent that. And if we do that, it works. There's a lot of studies that show that if we lower people's blood pressure, stroke risk goes down. We know if we leave it up, like in certain Asian countries where this is not promoted as strongly, the stroke risk is astronomical. And so that's, you know, one reason that drives me to keep talking about salt. Congestive heart failure. Anyone who has a weak heart and the muscle is not as strong as it was before are prone to congestive heart failure. And so I know when my patients go out and eat at the Chinese restaurant, you know, they come in the next day or the day after in congestive heart failure. And what that means is they've held on to maybe another liter of blood, of water in their blood, and then that makes it hard for their heart to pump it around. And so it seeps out into the lungs, which is a very easy place for fluid to go. So for those people who, you know, we talk a lot about salt, and I hand out these sheets that I gave you that shows what's in salt, what foods have salt in them. And so, you know, there are a couple more chairs here if someone wants to sit down, way over here.
Talk about not standing.
Okay, right, yeah. You'll get ankle swelling if you stand. Okay. Okay. You know, about 10 or 12 years ago, I don't know if any of you remember that, you know, there was this big push by the government to label all foods. And I remember that almost everyone's going to go broke because this is going to be so expensive for companies to put this label on and figure out how much salt was in there. Oh, I remember that war raged, but finally we won out, and every package, unless you get it from China, well, even then, but every package now has this label, and I bet you recognize that. And the wonderful thing is that it has sodium, right there, sodium, 210 milligrams. So everything has a label on it. And sometime when you aren't rushed through the grocery store and you have a little time, just turn the package over and look at Stouffer's TV dinners or Campbell's soup, or those wonderful cup of soups that we lived on when we went to school. I mean, they're just, a cup of soup has 1,100 milligrams of sodium in it. The experts, you know, for years have said we shouldn't eat more than 1,500 milligrams of sodium. Well, you just, you know, you can have a budget. You can start out with a budget in the morning and then subtract what you eat. And if you have anchovies for breakfast, then you kind of shot your wad for the day. So, you know, you can have some salty things if you just kind of figure out, well, okay, I'm going to have that Chinese dinner, but that's really hard. You get far too much in a Chinese dinner. Even for your budget of 2,000 milligrams of sodium. We say 2,000 milligrams of sodium. An article a couple months ago came out saying we're making too much of that, and that if we get people's sodium below 1,500, we see bad problems. I totally disagree with that. I think, A, most of us don't get below 1,500 milligrams, and B, the study wasn't really well done. But I think if you try and aim for 2,000 milligrams thereabouts, that's a teaspoon of salt a day, you're doing pretty good. And you notice we talk about sodium and salt. So salt has an element connected to it, so it's sodium chloride when we say salt. But we're really, what the active ingredients that we're really looking at is the sodium. And God, I get asked, so a teaspoon of salt, 2,300 milligrams of sodium. Doesn't that seem incredible? I mean, I've been doing this a long time and I still get amazed with that. You know, salt is fascinating. If you ever want to read some interesting history, you know, how salt came from the sea, from the Dead Sea. It's in the earth. It's in deep veins, you know, in the Earth's crust. All of the animals know where the salt licks are, where the salt comes up to the surface, because you can see the pathways in the woods where the animals have gone, you know, because salt tastes good to deer and squirrels and lots of people. So, but anyway, the salt started to be traded in, you know, in the AD and BC, and it was a very prized thing, you know, because people didn't mine salt like we do today, and it doesn't come in the blue container, and so salt was traded as a means of trading for things around the world, and so the history of salt is fascinating to read how it developed, and it wasn't basically until, you know, the early mid-1900s that we started to use more salt. It's very interesting. You know, when we were in the pioneer stage and so forth, salt wasn't as easily accessible. Around World War I and World War II, it became much more accessible. And in about the mid-1900s, it became iodized because people realized that you know, we did need some iodine. About 10 or 15 years ago came out a wonderful marketing tool called sea salt. And now everything's saying, oh, this is great because it has sea salt in it. Well, it's got this almost identical amount of sodium chloride in a molecule of sea salt. It's just truly a marketing thing. Don't get sucked into that. You'll pay more money for something with sea salt in it. It is, I guess it's natural, but salt's kind of natural too. You know, you mine it out of the ground. When I talk to people about salt shakers on the table, almost no one has a salt shaker practically anymore on the table. They get their salt from the packaged food we eat, not from our gardens. And usually I have some patients that are salting before they ever taste the stuff. And I'm sure you know people like that too. But most of us get the salt from the Prego spaghetti sauce or the wonderful mixes that are so easy to start with, or the rice aroni and the things that it comes, so you just have to put it on for 10 minutes and you're ready. It's those packaged things that really have a lot of salt in them. And so all of us who, you know, work and we want to come home and we want to pour something in the frying pan and get a meal going, it's hard. It's really hard. You know, even the stew that I make, you know, I like to start with a couple cans of broth. Well, have you ever looked at how much is in a can of broth? I mean, you know, you've kind of shot your wad right there. So now my husband orders me salt-free broth on Amazon.com, and it comes as a pallet, and we do it a couple times a year, and now I feel good about it because he has high blood pressure, and so there's another motivating fact for me to want to lower the salt intake. So look at the processed food, look at the things in the freezer. You know, most frozen vegetables are fine, but now they're adding those wonderful butter and flavorings and so forth. So you buy this nice package of seasoned corn or peas, and now it's got a lot of salt in it. So you got to read the labels on those. It's sneaky. Smith's carried a salt-free potato chip for quite a while, and occasionally you know, about 2 times a year I see them again. They must not sell well or something, but they don't have them very often. Fortunately, Smith's and Whole Foods and Sprouts all carry nuts in bulk that are unsalted. So you can get unsalted mixed nuts and unsalted cashews and unsalted almonds, and that's wonderful. But if you buy the ones with salt in them, that taste better, they eat more, they're high in salt. Nuts are a wonderful food, and I can't promote them enough. They're just great, but the salted ones are not good. So you got to be careful about that. Salt makes things taste better longer. So that's why McDonald's and Wendy's and Maria Callender's and all these nationwide chains, they add a lot of salt to their food because they then can keep it on the warming oven for, hours, and it still tastes good. So when you eat out, that's really hard. Who can order, French fries unsalted in a McDonald's? I don't think that's possible, right? So here's some interesting labels that I came across. Sodium-free truly is less than 5 milligrams per serving. Very low is 35. Low is 140. Reduced sodium, it's been reduced by 25% only. So the cans of Amy's reduced sodium soup that are $3 a can are only 25% less in sodium. So you have to be careful about that. And then when it says unsalted, it's just that they didn't add any salt to it. Well, that's a little squirrely. So just go back here to the beginning. So I think you can make food taste good with, so that stew I mentioned, oh my gosh, it has bay leaves and it has marjoram and thyme and lots of pepper. And in this part of the country, you can always add, a chili pepper. You have to be careful about salsa. If you make your own salsa, you can make it without salt, but a lot of the jars of salsa, read the labels on those because they can have a lot of salt in them. But ground up, red pepper, that's fine to put on things to make it taste a little better. And the unfortunate thing about as we get a little older, one of the things that starts to go is our taste buds. We don't taste as well. Things are bland. And so that's why, salted things taste better to people as they get older. And you have to fight against that. And one of the ways to do that is with chili pepper or pepper or other seasonings. When the recipe calls for a half teaspoon of thyme, I put 2 teaspoons. And people don't complain about my food. So I think it's doable. And I think it is a fixable problem in our modern society where we have some problems we can't fix. So I'll stop there and see if you have any burning questions. Yes?
I haven't seen this product for a while, but at one time I saw on the shelf potassium chloride, which was marketed as light salt. Is there any trade-offs with that?
Right, it's a good
Does it
point.
taste very salty?
Good question. So in the, you'll see the big blue container with sodium chloride and iodized salt, and then next to it is this light or blue container called LITE salt, kind of the color of your shirt, and it has half sodium chloride, half potassium chloride, and I use that in my house because I cook with that, and my husband can't tell the difference. It's pretty good. It's not bitter. When you get down to that little container that's this tall and dark blue, that's potassium chloride. And you could try it, but it's kind of bitter. It is kind of, potassium chloride is kind of bitter. But it's okay, except if you have kidney disease and you don't get rid of potassium correctly, like most of us do, and wash it out in your urine, you can get, with those little containers, you can get really high potassium levels, and that can be life-threatening. And so you got to be worried. Make sure if your kidney function is normal, it's probably fine. if you have any kind of kidney dysfunction, you probably ought to ask your doctor and make sure that your potassium is not high from your kidney dysfunction. Good question. Any other? Yes.
I found that lemon juice helps. Too. They just put lemon juice or lemon rind.
Absolutely. It
Something
gives it
perks
a
up little bit.
better flavor. Yeah, right. So no, anything you can think of to jazz things up. Those jalapeno peppers are great. So, yeah. And yes.
When you're baking, is it important to do the salt? Like, like if something has to rise, does the salt have anything to do with?
I think it does. Now, I'm not an expert in the chemistry of baking, but people have told me that salt is helpful in certain breads, and so often, though, for an entire recipe, it's like half a teaspoon for 3 or 4 loaves. So, you know, it's not too much. But I think that's right. I think you do need that in some, because isn't unleavened bread? Didn't they have? Anyway, that's a important point. But I think that's okay because you're not. It's not much. But
In the baking that I do, I frequently cut back on the salt, and it doesn't seem to ruin it.
okay, how far can you cut back? Could you?
Well, I'll do half to even a fourth. of
Right.
it.
Okay. There you go. There's the answer.
But
Good.
you can experiment with it a little bit, depends on what it is.
Good. Any other questions? It's an interesting topic. It's all around us every day. Fortunately, you know, the fast food restaurants are now putting those labels on things, and so you're able to tell how many calories, how many fat calories, how many sodium calories. So maybe that will move the industry along a little bit. So, good. Well, thank you for coming on such a gorgeous day. Wow.